General Hospital spoilers for Friday, August 15th reveal that Jocelyn had told herself she could handle it, that she could stay level-headed and keep her focus on the bigger picture. But the reality was far messier. Every time she caught sight of Vaughn and Britt together, some sharp, involuntary reaction flared inside her. It was in the way Vaughn's usually guarded posture seemed to loosen in Britt's company, the way his eyes tracked her movements with a familiarity that was almost intimate. Britt, for her part, didn't make things easier. She carried herself with that blend of composure and provocation she'd perfected over the years, tilting her head just enough when Vaughn spoke, smiling in a way that dared anyone to accuse her of something they couldn't prove. To anyone else, these might have been small, inconsequential gestures. To Jocelyn, they felt like quiet betrayals unfolding right in front of her. She told herself she was being vigilant because Britt was dangerous. Because the woman was tied to forces capable of destroying lives without leaving fingerprints. That was true, and it was reason enough to keep watch. But buried under that justification was a truth Jocelyn didn't want to name. She hated the idea that Vaughn might be letting Britt into corners of his trust he hadn't fully opened to her. It wasn't just suspicion. It was jealousy, raw, unvarnished, and simmering hotter with each interaction she witnessed. The longer it went on, the more it colored her behavior. She began inserting herself into their moments, stepping between them under the guise of urgency. If they were talking, she found a reason to interrupt. If Vaughn lingered by Britt's side, each remark sharpened just enough to be felt. She started asking loaded questions in public settings, about Britt's recent activities, about who she'd been meeting, about what she knew regarding certain incidents, as if probing for information but also laying down a subtle claim to the moral high ground. Britt noticed, of course. She always noticed. Offering answers just ambiguous enough to spark more questions, or glancing at Vaughn in a way that made the air between the three of them hum with unspoken tension. Vaughn himself seemed increasingly caught in the crossfire, his attempts to mediate falling flat. Every time he tried to redirect a conversation or lighten the mood, it only underscored how uncomfortable he was, and how far the situation had already spiraled beyond his control. Jocelyn told herself she could keep it contained. The sudden drop in her voice when she addressed Britt directly. It reached a point where even those not directly involved could sense the current. Colleagues, mutual acquaintances. There was an inevitability to it now, a sense that all the tension, all the carefully veiled barbs and countermaneuvers, were building toward a single, visible break. Jocelyn could feel it, too. It wasn't just about Vaughn anymore, or even about Britt. It was about the fact that she'd been holding too much back for too long. Forcing herself to play the part of the calm observer while her instincts screamed at her to act. The jealousy, the suspicion, the frustration, they had all fused into a single sharp edge that was begging to cut through the veneer of control she'd been maintaining. And when that edge finally struck, it wasn't going to be in the privacy of a closed-door meeting. It was going to happen where people could see it, where words would be remembered, and where alliances might fracture beyond repair. The explosion, when it came, wouldn't just be a heated argument. It would be a public declaration of battle lines, forcing everyone in their shared orbit to choose a side. And deep down, Jocelyn knew that once it happened, nothing, her relationship with Vaughn, her perception of Britt, or the precarious balance of power between them, would ever be the same again. Isaiah's stomach churned as he observed the interaction between Curtis and Jordan, feeling the weight of what he was witnessing settle heavily in his chest. It wasn't just the closeness between them that unsettled him, it was the undeniable familiarity in their behavior. He had known Curtis for years, admired his strength and integrity, and had seen him navigate difficult relationships with an admirable level of care. But what he saw now, the way Curtis was leaning in toward Jordan with that look in his eyes, the kind of look that spoke of something more than mere friendship, made his blood run cold. The casualness with which Curtis and Jordan exchanged words, the slight touches, the easy laughter, it all spoke of an intimacy that Isaiah had never seen between them before. He had always assumed Curtis and Portia shared a strong, unbreakable bond, one built on mutual respect and trust. But now, watching them from across the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Curtis, The man he had always admired seemed to be crossing a line, one that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't the first time Isaiah had sensed something was off between Curtis and Jordan. There had been other moments, smaller instances that he had brushed aside at first, a lingering glance. A shared smile that seemed to hold more than just pleasantries, but this was different. This was no longer something subtle. It was blatant. And it had the power to tear apart everything Curtis and Portia had built. Isaiah's mind raced as he tried to process the situation. He couldn't understand it, couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with the Curtis he thought he knew. He had always believed Curtis to be a man of integrity, someone who would never hurt Portia. Especially not in such a public, undeniable way. But as he continued to watch the two of them, the reality began to sink in. Curtis was betraying Portia. And he was doing it with someone who had been close to their family for far too long. Isaiah knew that if he allowed this to continue, the consequences would be devastating, not just for Portia. Isaiah knew the truth was a weapon, and he was reluctant to use it unless it was absolutely necessary. The last thing he wanted was to become entangled in a situation that could destroy not only Curtis and Portia's relationship but also the friendships that had been built over years of trust. The internal conflict within Isaiah grew stronger with each passing moment. He couldn't stay silent, not when he knew something so important was being kept from Portia. But speaking up meant confronting Curtis, a man he had always respected, and putting his own relationships at risk. Isaiah wasn't sure he was ready for that. The weight of the decision pressed on him. The tension between Curtis and Jordan couldn't go on unchecked. It wasn't just about the betrayal of Portia's trust, it was about the truth. The lies, the secrets. The quiet manipulations, they had to be confronted before they spiraled further out of control. Isaiah's mind kept coming back to one question: what would happen if he didn't act? Would the situation fix itself, or would it only grow worse with time? He realized that the longer he stayed silent, the more he was allowing this secret to fester. To poison the people he cared about. The time had come for him to make a choice, to step forward and speak up, no matter the cost. As he weighed his options, Isaiah couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. Confronting Curtis about his betrayal would change everything. It would expose the lies, tear down the facade of their friendship, and force everyone to confront the truth. But there was no other choice. Silence would only breed more lies, more hurt. It would break Portia's heart even more than the truth ever could. The confrontation between Curtis and Isaiah was inevitable. And with it, everything that had been carefully built over the years, the trust, the respect. He had to face the truth, no matter how painful. Drew had always been an opportunist, but lately, he had become something far more dangerous, an expert at manipulation. Using every resource at his disposal to twist the narrative and control the people around him. It wasn't enough that he had already set his sights on Michael, bending him into compliance with threats and half-truths. Now, Drew had found another angle, a more insidious strategy to tighten his grip on Michael's life. And it was a maneuver that would leave even the most hardened individuals reeling. This time, the evidence Drew uncovered was damning, at least on the surface. Willow, who had once been so careful, had been caught up in a web of her own making, with Drew at the center of it all. The supposed evidence was explosive. Footage of Willow in the same vicinity as Daisy on a night when something had gone horribly wrong. A chilling narrative was forming, one that depicted Willow as a woman on the edge. If he could make Willow the villain in this story, then Michael's trust in her would crumble, leaving him more vulnerable than ever to Drew's influence. But for Willow, the shock of it all was not just the possibility of being falsely accused, it was the weight of knowing that Drew had manipulated something so personal, something so painful, into a weapon designed to break her. It wasn't just about the footage, it was about the twisted way Drew had created a narrative where she was the villain. The one responsible for something that wasn't even her fault. As she watched the so-called evidence play out in front of her, Willow could feel the walls closing in. She had tried to be cautious, had worked so hard to keep her life in balance, but now Drew had taken that balance and turned it against her. The idea that Willow could be tied to a kidnapping attempt, especially one involving Daisy, was not only outrageous, but it felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked so hard to build. To have Drew use her past vulnerabilities against her, to spin a tale that painted her as a threat, was a blow she couldn't accept. The idea that Michael might believe any part of this fabricated story sent a wave of panic coursing through her. She had to act fast. But how could she explain herself when the evidence was right in front of him, when Drew had already planted seeds of doubt? What was worse, however, was the realization that Drew was playing a much larger game. This wasn't just about controlling Michael, it was about dismantling everything Willow held dear. Drew wasn't just trying to discredit her. He was trying to destroy her from the inside out, targeting her relationships, her trust with Michael, and even her own sense of self. He was using her worst fears against her. He had planted the idea that Willow was the one behind the so-called kidnapping attempt, twisting the events into something unrecognizable. And now, she was left scrambling to prove herself innocent. While Drew stood by, his smile hidden behind a mask of false concern. For Michael, the consequences were devastating. Drew knew exactly how to play on his vulnerabilities. How to use his protective instincts to push him into making decisions that would further his own agenda. As Michael struggled to process the evidence, torn between his loyalty to Willow and the growing doubts seated in his mind, Drew's grip on the situation grew stronger. He had orchestrated this with precision. And now Michael was a pawn in his game. The emotional manipulation was subtle but effective, as Drew worked to separate Michael from everyone who could help him, including Willow. Willow, meanwhile, was left to grapple with the fallout of Drew's latest manipulation. The shock of seeing her life twisted into something so unrecognizable was overwhelming. And the fear of losing Michael, the one person who had stood by her through everything, was almost too much to bear. She had to fight back. Part of her was afraid of what would happen if Michael didn't believe her. The emotional impact of this new revelation, this new level of manipulation, was devastating. It felt like the walls were closing in. What Drew had done wasn't just about breaking her, it was about breaking everything she had ever cared about. Using her own emotions as the means of destruction. This new shock wasn't just about what was happening in the present, it was about what Drew had set in motion. A series of events that would change everything. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and now it was only a matter of time before everything Willow had built, everything she had fought for, began to unravel. Drew's manipulation was no longer subtle, it was a storm, one that threatened to destroy everything in its path. And as the storm gathered strength, the one that was burning in his mind and driving him forward with an intensity that almost felt like obsession, was different. This time, it wasn't just about the usual high-tension jobs or the operations he was used to orchestrating. This time, it was personal. This time, it was about Danny, the son of his closest friend. The boy he had watched grow up, now trapped in a nightmare of his own making, locked behind bars. The weight of that realization was heavy, more than any physical challenge Jason had ever faced. Danny, wrongfully imprisoned, was running out of time, and Jason knew that if he didn't act quickly, the consequences would be devastating. The justice system had failed him, as it had so many others in their world of shadows, and Jason couldn't stand by and let the kid suffer. He wasn't going to allow anyone, not even the law. Jason had to gather enough leverage to make sure Danny's release would be forced. He knew the right people to blackmail, the right favors to call in, the right information to exploit. He needed to act with precision, pulling strings in ways only someone with his experience could. But the danger was also on the inside. There were forces in the prison who would do anything to prevent Danny from walking out a free man, and Jason knew that to get him out, he'd have to make some difficult and sometimes ruthless. This wasn't just about getting Danny out of jail, it was about ensuring the kid's safety once he was free. The power dynamics were shifting, both on the outside and within the prison walls. And Jason felt the pressure mounting. The more he dove into the details of Danny's case, the more he uncovered, the more he realized that there were forces far beyond the scope of his initial plan. Every new piece of information he uncovered seemed to complicate matters further, and what was once a straightforward mission became entangled with layers of deception and conspiracy. This new development, this unexpected shift, became a critical turning point for Jason. He had always prided himself on being the one who could handle anything, who could take on the impossible and turn it into a victory. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The new twist in Danny's case was bigger than any of Jason's past missions. It wasn't just about him anymore. There were people involved in this that Jason had never anticipated, and they had the power to change everything. The realization hit him harder than anything he had expected. The forces working against him were far more formidable than he had ever imagined. The more he fought to save Danny. A corrupt system that ran much deeper than he could have ever predicted. It was a fight that would take every ounce of strategy, every connection he had, and every ounce of his determination to win. He knew that saving Danny meant navigating a path that was fraught with danger, filled with betrayals, and layered with complexities he could never have foreseen. But for Jason, there was no turning back. The stakes were too high. And as he moved forward, he could feel the world shifting beneath him, the adjustments in the plan becoming more urgent, more necessary with every passing hour. The more Jason worked to get Danny out, the clearer it became. This was no longer just about him trying to save a friend's son. It was about a much bigger mission, one that would change the course of everything they thought they knew about loyalty, power, and justice. Jason wasn't just trying to rescue Danny from prison, he was uncovering a much deeper conspiracy, one that threatened to unravel everything they had fought for. And in the process, Jason was forced to confront the kind of enemies he had avoided for years, enemies with far more power and far more reach than he had ever been prepared to face. As the pieces fell into place, Jason realized that the rescue mission had become a battleground. He wasn't just trying to get Danny out of jail anymore, he was waging war against the very forces that controlled their lives. And with every new piece of information, every twist in the plan, the danger grew. And what Jason couldn't yet see was that this mission, this struggle, would be the turning point in a fight far bigger than he could have ever imagined. Curtis stood in the dimly lit room, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. His instincts told him that now, more than ever, was the time to act. Drew was vulnerable, his weaknesses laid bare. And Curtis had the opportunity to strike, to destroy Drew once and for all. But as much as the idea of eliminating his rival tempted him, something inside Curtis hesitated. His mind raced through a series of questions he couldn't quite answer, and with each passing moment, the decision became heavier, more complicated. The opportunity was undeniably perfect. Drew's rise had been swift and dangerous, and Curtis had always been keenly aware of the man's ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. Drew had hurt people, betrayed those who trusted him, and caused enough collateral damage that Curtis felt a certain satisfaction at the thought of bringing him down. But there was something about this moment. Something about the way Drew had maneuvered himself into a corner, that felt off. Curtis was not one to rush into decisions without careful calculation, and this was no different. As much as he wanted to bring Drew to his knees, Curtis could feel something stirring within him, a hesitation, an unease that he couldn't shake. It wasn't just about Drew's betrayal anymore. It was about the fact that Curtis had become obsessed with this idea of defeating him. What began as a plan to neutralize a threat had now morphed into an all-consuming fixation. Every move Curtis made, every conversation he had, seemed to be centered around Drew and the intricate web of schemes that surrounded him. He had begun to see Drew in every shadow, hear his name in every whispered conversation, and feel his presence in the most unexpected places. Drew was no longer just a rival, he had become an obsession. This obsession had started subtly. At first, it was the small victories, the little signs that Curtis was getting closer to his goal. He'd gather intel here, plant a seed of doubt there. Slowly, but surely, Drew was being cornered. But somewhere along the way, the thrill of outsmarting his opponent turned into something darker. Something that had little to do with strategy or logic and everything to do with a consuming need to destroy Drew entirely. Curtis realized, with growing unease, that his desire to eliminate Drew had stopped being about justice or revenge. It had become personal. The obsession took root in the most unexpected way. It became part of Curtis's identity. His days were consumed with plans, with plotting, with the growing need to get even. He replayed every interaction he had with Drew, every slight, every betrayal, and the more he thought about it, the more the idea of letting Drew off the hook seemed impossible. It wasn't just about ending Drew's reign of manipulation, it was about proving something to himself. Something that had been festering for far too long. But as the obsession deepened, Curtis began to realize that the pursuit of vengeance was changing him. He wasn't the man he once was. The man who could see beyond his own anger and take measured steps toward his goal. No, now he was clouded by emotion, consumed by a need to destroy, to remove Drew from his life permanently. Every plan became more desperate, every move more reckless. The line between justice and obsession blurred, and Curtis found himself at a crossroads, unsure of who he had become. What had once been a calculated mission to eliminate a threat now felt like a dangerous spiral, pulling him further away from the man he used to be. Curtis realized, in the quiet moments between action, that he was no longer simply fighting Drew. He was fighting himself, battling the darker parts of his nature that he hadn't known existed. The obsession that had taken root inside him was no longer a tool, it had become the force driving him, and Curtis didn't know how to stop it. As he faced the decision before him, whether to finally strike the fatal blow to Drew's empire or to back off and reclaim his sense of control, Curtis found himself paralyzed. The opportunity was there, as clear as day, but with each passing second, the cost of his obsession grew more apparent. He was no longer fighting for justice or retribution. He was fighting to prove something to himself, something that might not even exist. And in that moment of indecision, Curtis realized the true weight of his fixation. It wasn't just about Drew anymore. It was about Curtis's need to destroy, to win at all costs, even if it meant losing himself in the process. The obsession had taken over. And now Curtis had to confront the darkness within himself, the part of him that wanted to destroy Drew not because it was right, but because it was all-consuming. As the night stretched on and the weight of his decision pressed down on him, Curtis knew that whatever choice he made, it would define him. He could go through with his plans. Destroy Drew once and for all, and walk away with a sense of victory. But at what cost? Or, he could pull back, regain his sense of self, and let Drew continue his reign. Either way, the obsession had already changed everything. And that realization, more than anything else, was the most terrifying of all.